This podcast may contain content that is graphic and disturbing in nature. Listener discretion is advised.
It was another school day, and the bus was on its regular morning run, picking up students and transporting them to school. It stopped at a red light just after crossing over railway tracks. And that's when a commotion broke out on the bus. This is Apple for the Teacher, a true crime podcast. I'm your host, Anna Thomas. Today's episode is called Train Wreck. The school bus drove over a railway crossing. What happened? Every day around the world, school students make their morning commutes to their schools. And so it was on a day in October 1995 that the students from the Cary Grove High School made their way to school. The school was located in Fox River Grove in the state of Illinois in the US. Two students who were on their way to school that morning were Zach and Katie. They were catching the school bus and waited at the bus stop for their bus to arrive. However, they noticed that the bus appeared to be running late. They waited and it finally arrived 20 minutes late.
We were just, standing around. And then it got to be quarter till, and people started going home because it's too late. And finally, the bus came at 6:55.
But when it arrived, they noticed that their regular driver was not driving the bus. He hadn't come into work that day, and a substitute driver drove the bus instead. However, she wasn't familiar with the bus route and asked Zach and Katie to help with directions.
I got on her. She started right in with, I need somebody to help me out the route. I don't know it. So I was like, okay, I'll do it.
She had no clue to go straight or whatever, It's like she was totally confused.
So Zach and Katie sat behind the driver, guiding her on where to go. Meanwhile, another student named Lane also noticed that the bus was late. It was a particularly cold morning, and he recalled waiting in the cold.
It was chilly. That's kind of what made the wait longer, is that we were kind of cold waiting for the bus. We were just kind of holding our arms tight like this and trying to keep warm until the bus showed up.
So the bus continued to pick up students, including another boy named Jeff. He was a senior and had only just got his driver's license, but still caught the bus that day. His friend Joe also had his license, but had car trouble and so had to catch the bus. Another girl called Tiffany also caught the bus, and she was particularly happy that day, as just the day before she had received her first paycheck from her first job. As the school bus picked up Joe, there was another boy named John also catching the bus. He was in 9th grade. As he was a senior, Joe told John to sit at the front, as the back was reserved for the seniors.
He said that the back was for upperclassmen, so I just kind of moved up. If he hadn't told me that day to sit towards the front, I probably would have sat in the back that day.
After being guided by Zach and Katie, the bus had been able to pick up all of the 35 students and then headed to their school. It was then that the bus had to stop at a red light. As the bus driver waited for the light to turn green, she suddenly heard kids yelling and screaming at the back of the bus. Some of the kids had looked out the window and saw a train coming straight towards them.
There's a train coming. There's a train coming. Move, move.
I turned around, I could see the train as it kept getting closer, and I just kept thinking to myself, oh my God.
When I looked out the window and saw the gate go off and start to come down, that's when I got up and ran.
Amy and myself started screaming for the bus, go, go, go.
Kids started to crawl over seats and go down the aisles and just trying to get out of the way.
As I ran, I was telling people to run and saying, I'm going to run, let's everybody run off the bus.
Zach said, I was just sitting there and then I heard a loud horn and I got a really sick feeling. I had my eyes closed the whole time. I was down in a crouch position so I wouldn't get hurt. Then there was a terrible crash. After that, there was glass and blood everywhere. I could tell right away it was bad.
I remember hearing wind breeze through as the impact occurred. Cold air just rush in, and my feet left the ground.
The student Katie, who had helped guide the driver, gave the following account some years later about the crash.
So the morning of the bus accident, normal morning, getting ready at home, walking to the bus stop. It was very cold that day, so we were freezing and the bus was very late. And when it finally came, we were very excited to get on the bus, and the bus driver started off right away with, "Can you help me with the route?" I've never done this route before, so myself and two other friends said sure, and we sat up front and showed her the route. We did the whole route and picked up the last students, and that's when you come up to the train tracks. And I don't remember if the old bus driver ever went over them or stopped behind them and never paid attention to it. The radio was very loud. We were listening to Janet Jackson, Runaway. We were all kind of jamming and dancing along. And the students in the back had heard the gate come down and hit the back of the bus. Us up front, we did not hear it. And started running to the front of the bus. By the time I looked back and looked forward, it was too late to do anything. Within seconds, we were hit. And after we got hit, the thing I remember the most was the silence, the dead silence, and you couldn't hear anything. You couldn't hear a bird, you couldn't hear it breathing, it was nothing. It was complete silence, and that probably only lasted a couple seconds, but it felt like eternity. Then the screaming and yelling started to begin. The bus driver got up and looked in the back, and her face was just pure horror. And so I stood up, and I remembered, from the bus drills that we used to have in school, that if there's an accident, get off the bus right away, because you don't know if the engine's going to blow up. So we all just kind of ran off, and there was a lot of people outside.
So how was it that the train was able to crash into the school bus? The driver had crossed over a railway crossing and then came to a stop at a set of traffic lights just after the railway tracks. But what she didn't know was that the back of the bus was still protruding onto the railway track. When the kids saw the train coming, they began screaming, and some ran down to the front yelling at her to move, move, move. But the driver was disorientated with the noise of the kids screaming. By this time, the crossing boom gates came down, hitting the back of the bus. When the train had been 21 seconds away from the crossing, the automatic warning system had been activated. The lights at the crossing began to flash, and the bells sounded, followed by the lowering of the boom gates, which struck the bus. The train driver saw the bus hanging over the track and promptly sounded his horn, as well as engaging the emergency brake. But the train could not slow down in time, colliding with the bus. The entire body of the bus was completely ripped away from its chassis, landing intact nearby and also up the right way. Right across the road from the crossing, there was a cafe, and a nurse had been on her way to work and stopped in to have a coffee. Helen Getchell saw the accident happen and immediately rushed over to the scene. She first came across Jeff, the boy who had only recently got his driver's license, and began administering first aid.
I yelled out, I said, "I'm losing him, can you please get a suction?" Somebody ran across the street, I don't know who, got me a turkey baster, so I suctioned him off, and he died in my arms.
Of the 35 students on board, 5 died at the scene and another 2 died later in hospital. But the 9th grader, John, reflected on how lucky he had been when Joe had instructed him to sit at the front.
I'm lucky in a way that he told me to sit towards the front. So I'm glad that he did, because I guess you could say he saved my life.
But so sadly, Joe himself died in the crash. He would have driven to school that day if it hadn't been for his car troubles. And Tiffany, the girl who had received her first paycheck, she also lost her life. All those who died had been sitting in the last 4 rows of the bus. An investigation was conducted by the National Transportation Safety Board, which firstly looked into both the bus and train drivers, and it was determined that they had the necessary training and experience and that there was no alcohol or illicit drugs in their systems. The weather that day was also ruled out as a factor. It was concluded that there were three main causes to the crash: a lack of safety training for bus drivers stopped at railway crossings, a traffic light that didn't give drivers enough time to cross the tracks, and a poorly designed intersection. The investigation was able to put together a timeline of the sequence of events on that day as follows. It began with the regular bus driver being sick that day, and the substitute driver had also been assigned to another route. So the bus dispatcher called another female driver to drive the bus as there was no one else available at short notice. Her normal role was as the Assistant Director of Transportation. She had driven school buses before, but was not familiar with that particular route. She had been provided with a route map, but asked the first students that she picked up to guide her, which were Zach and Katie. So they sat behind her, giving her directions. The bus had picked up all of the school students, with a total of 35 passengers on board. The bus then arrived at the railway crossing, which had two sets of tracks. The road the bus had travelled on then came to an end at the railway crossing and intersected with a highway. In order to turn onto the highway either left or right, vehicles had to first cross over the railway line and then queue at the traffic lights just a short distance past the tracks. When the bus arrived at the railway crossing, the driver stopped the bus and put the hazard lights on. She then opened the door and looked right and left. As there was no train coming, she closed the bus door and proceeded over the railway tracks. Zach also said that he had looked both ways, but he hadn't seen any trains. The driver noticed the traffic light was red and thought she needed to cross the tracks in order to trip the signal to turn green. So she crossed the tracks, but the bus did not fit between the tracks and the red traffic light. When interviewed, the bus driver stated, quote, "It never entered my mind that there wasn't enough room for that bus to fit. So while she sat at the red light, she had no idea the back of the bus was partly on the track." The data that was gathered was able to determine the following timeline. At 32 seconds before impact, the approaching train was detected by the crossing processor. The speed of the train and its distance from the crossing was calculated, allowing the processor to determine that it would wait 8 seconds before notifying of the train's arrival. At 24 seconds before impact, the train notified the crossing of its approach. 1 second later, the traffic signals began their cycle. The lights prepared to turn red, but also gave time for pedestrians to clear the intersection. It is at this point that the train driver first saw the bus crossing over the tracks at a slow speed. The train driver calculated that if the bus continued at its current pace, it should clear the track well before the train arrived. At 12 seconds before impact, the lights turned yellow, then turned red at 7.5 seconds before impact. At 6 seconds before impact, the lights turned green. At 5 seconds, the train driver realised that the bus had not moved off the track and activated the emergency brakes. But it was too late and the impact took place. Before the impact, the students at the back of the bus saw the approaching train and started yelling, "A train is coming. We're still on the tracks. Move the bus. I think we're going to get hit by a train." It was determined that the commotion from the students confused the driver and that she didn't understand what they were saying. School buses are noisy at the best of times, but there had also been an FM radio on the bus with one speaker positioned right near the driver's head, so the music playing also added to the confusion. The driver said she had not heard the train horn, the crossing bell, or the boom gate hitting the back of the bus. She had looked into her rear view mirror when the yelling started, but meanwhile the red light had turned to green. It was determined that if she had seen the green light, there may have been enough time to pull away from the track and thus avoid the collision. The investigators also interviewed the regular driver, who gave the following statement. She stated that if the traffic light was red, she would stop south of the tracks and only cross the tracks when the light turned green. She wasn't aware of the size of the queuing area in front of the lights, so thought that it was safer to wait before the crossing until it turned green, and that way she wouldn't have to stop in the queuing area. Although the bus driver was trained and experienced, it was concluded that she had not understood the positioning of the bus on the road in relation to other vehicles and objects. However, this lack of understanding was blamed on the ineffective bus driver training curriculum. The curriculum provided no specific or practical instruction on recognizing the position of a bus on the road. Other drivers were aware of the potential risks with this particular crossing, but not through their training, but rather because they were familiar with the crossing due to travelling the route so many times. It was interesting to read that the FM radio on the bus was often used to pacify the students. So it tended to make the students quieten down to listen to the music or the conversation on the radio. And I can totally understand this, that the driver needed to have a quiet bus with few distractions. However, in this case, the radio only added to the factors that all conspired together to cause the accident. I know when I have travelled on longer bus trips, we would always play a DVD. It definitely made the students quieter. The kids are just so excited going on a bus trip, which you really can't blame them for. So, following this accident, it was recommended that the radio speakers be placed in strategic locations away from the driver. So, was this accident just the result of a driver not knowing the route and the commotion of the students on the bus? The investigation also determined that there had been complaints from other drivers about the lack of space at the intersection, and it had a history of problems. The issue started when the highway had been widened, thus narrowing the space that separated the road from the tracks. The highway ran parallel to the train tracks and had been upgraded from 2 lanes to 4 lanes. However, the distance was reduced between the highway and the railroad from 60 feet to 30 feet. Prior to these changes, there had been plenty of room for a bus to be stopped at the lights without protruding onto the tracks. Issues were also found with the timing of the warning lights and the traffic lights. The crossing lights activated 20 seconds before the arrival of a train, while the traffic lights only allowed cars to clear 18 seconds after the railway signals activated, therefore giving vehicles 2 to 6 seconds to clear the tracks. The timings were under different jurisdictions, and no communication took place between the two parties to coordinate the timings. And only a few months before the crash, the signals were changed to allow pedestrians to cross, which further compromised the timings. If the pedestrian crossing hadn't been installed, the bus would have had a green light 12 seconds earlier than it did, and the collision would almost certainly have been avoided. The pedestrian access had also been criticised, as it was not a location with a heavy pedestrian use, so many considered it to be unnecessary to provide the access to pedestrians, and as seen, it contributed to the accident. After presenting its findings, the National Transportation Safety Board made the following recommendations. It was recommended that the school district identify and evaluate route hazards, and that bus drivers be required to exchange information about hazards to other drivers, such as the short queuing area at the lights. Another recommendation stated that the particular circumstances of this crash should be provided to bus drivers, along with training about vehicle positioning on the road. All railroad and highway crossings should be reviewed and modified to ensure vehicles have enough space to clear the crossing. Communication should also be established between the various jurisdictions so that a coordinated approach can be implemented in the operation of railway and road signals. And the placement of radios in buses should also be reviewed and modified where needed. As sad as it is, it's often the case that tragedies like this one lead to improved safety, and no doubt now, 25 years later, the system is greatly improved. I read about one particular change where new bus routes were created to cut down the number of times that buses would have to cross railways. Prior to the crash, 70% of the routes in that particular school district involved crossing railways, but that was reduced down to only 10%. Wow, that's pretty good, isn't it? This probably means that some routes will be longer to avoid railways, but so be it, in the effort to have safety for students. After the accident, as can be expected, the families filed a lawsuit and a total of $27 million was paid to the victims of the crash. So we have heard from the students involved, but what about the bus and train drivers? The bus driver has not made any public statements since the crash, which we certainly can't judge her for. I would imagine she suffered greatly, and I don't think her silence means that she didn't become affected by the tragedy. However, the train driver did share his thoughts about what happened. His name is Ford Dotson Jr. He had 20 years' experience driving trains before the accident and had been involved in other accidents involving fatalities, which were mostly from people committing suicide. The first death really rattled him, but he somehow managed to climb back into the cab. However, the school bus crash was different. He said, "These kids are dead and hurt, and they had no control of their lives. The kids didn't have a decision in this." In an interview 25 years after the accident, he spoke about the recurring dream that he has had over the years and still has today. He said, "The 200-ton locomotive at the rear of the train pushes 6 passenger cars and the cab control car. It's an express, and ahead the signals are green, so I jump it up to the maximum speed, 70 miles per hour. I cross the Fox River, which sparkles in the sunlight. In the distance, I see a school bus. It's moving slowly across the tracks, but there's no reason to panic. I nudge the brake handle just in case and blow the train whistle. 2 long blasts, a short, another long. But something is wrong. The rear of the bus remains on the tracks. I pump several short blasts on the air horn. I keep at it because the bus isn't moving. As the train hurtles forward, I slam the brake handle all the way. That's the point in the dream when I always wake up, shaking just before the impact." He was told to take as much time off work as he needed, but he only had 1 week off, figuring it would be too hard to come back the longer he stayed away. One can imagine how hard it must have been to travel through the crash site again, but somehow he managed to work for another 20 years, finally retiring after 40 years on the railways. So while I was researching this story, I became amazed that more children didn't die. You can find an aerial photo of the crash scene with the whole body of the bus resting in one spot and the chassis in another spot. They were 42 feet apart or 12 metres. A chassis is the bottom part or the base of the bus where the body, engine and wheels sit on. So the kids would have had the metal floor of the bus between their feet and the road surface. I found a diagram which showed where the students were sitting on the bus and where the deaths occurred. There were 3 boys in the back row, all who died. On the left side of the bus, which was hit, in the last 4 rows, 6 out of 8 were killed. The other 2 only sustained minor injuries. So it's amazing that kids so close to each other either died or were hardly injured. Of the 12 kids in the back 4 rows, 7 died. The train hit the left side of the bus, but only 2 died on that left side. Yet on the right side, 5 died. Now I thought that was peculiar. With the bus being hit on the left side and the force pushing the bus forward, it's amazing that some kids on the left side survived, but no one on the right did. And the other peculiar aspect was that 4 of the dead kids had been flung out of the bus, yet 3 of them had been sitting on the right side, but they were located on the ground next to the left side of the bus. So they moved in the opposite direction. So how is that possible? This might have something to do with the fact that the body of the bus had also rotated anti-clockwise during the impact. But I can see how hitting the back of the bus at a roughly 90-degree angle would have rotated the bus anti-clockwise. Just imagine the bus in a horizontal position and then the train hits the right end vertically. So all of that together determined who died and how the 4 kids were ejected. And it's also amazing that 4 students were not hurt at all. But can you imagine? The whole body of the bus came off the chassis and landed the right way up, with all but 4 students still inside the bus. The train only had minor damage and did not derail. This story just makes me wonder how the kids who survived felt about trains after the crash. Now, we all know that kids just love trains, so it's sad that that love may have changed. And while I was researching this story, I came across a video which showed the different railway crossing bells in different countries, and I thought it was really, really interesting, the different sounds. So here are some crossing bells from different countries. The first one is the UK. South Korea. Germany. The US. The Czech Republic. Japan. India. Australia. France. Ireland. Poland. Italy. Sweden. The Netherlands. Croatia. Finland. Indonesia. Latvia. Russia. Switzerland. Spain. Thailand. Argentina. Denmark. Lithuania. Norway. Luxembourg. Isn't that really interesting? When I listen to some of those, I actually feel like I'm listening to either ambulance bells or police bells because they sound very similar to what we have here in Australia. So I think it would be very confusing to travel to different countries and hear these bells and not realise what you're actually listening to. But I just thought it was really interesting. So those who lost their lives were Jeffrey Clark, 17, Michael Hoffman, 14, Joseph Colty, 16, Sean Robinson, 14, Tiffany Schneider, 15, Stephanie Fulham, 15, and Susanna Guzman, 18. Each of them can be found on the Find a Grave website if you'd like to leave them a message. Let's now preview the next episode. It's called Hot for Teacher. The student secretly recorded a conversation with her teacher. Why? And to end this episode, I will leave you with this quote. Only a school bus driver would turn their back on a busload of kids. Bye for now, and remember to be a good apple.